Greetings and salutations. My name is Michael Schwahn, I'm the nerd in the snapback, and this is your one-take review of Bayonetta 3. Bayonetta 3 is a character action game or a spectacle fighter, depending on kind of what you want to call them. It is the third game in the Bayonetta franchise. Now, the first game did originally come out on PlayStation 3, it is as well as Xbox 360, and has since found its way to other platforms, including on PC through Steam, and then very, very recently on the Nintendo Switch. After Bayonetta 1 came out, we kind of didn't know what was going to happen to the franchise, and ultimately the franchise as a whole was saved by Nintendo. Nintendo paid to have Bayonetta 2 published, and it was an exclusive onto the Wii U before later making its way onto the Nintendo Switch. So you can play the entire trilogy now on a modern console, that console being the Nintendo Switch. But I would recommend, if you are going to play Bayonetta 1, unless you just want it all on the Switch, I'd probably go with the Steam version because it is going to be the best version of that game. Now, that said, while this is the third game in that series, there is not necessarily a need for you to play the other games before you play Bayonetta 3. If you want to, you're absolutely welcome to, but I don't feel like you need to, and this is coming from somebody who has played all three games. When you're playing through Bayonetta 3, there will be some moments, some reveals, some twists that will be a little bit more fun if you have played Bayonetta 1 and 2, but it is by no means a requirement in any stretch for you to be able to jump straight into Bayonetta 3, enjoy the game, and enjoy its story. Now, before we go any farther, I want to talk about the characters. Two characters in particular. The titular character, Bayonetta. I feel like it's going to be impossible, really, to talk about Bayonetta 3 without talking about the drama surrounding Bayonetta 3. So, before this entry, Bayonetta was voiced by an individual named Hellena Taylor. They voiced Bayonetta in Bayonetta 1 and 2, as well as anywhere else that Bayonetta had appeared at that time, such as Super Smash Bros. Now, Platinum Games, the developers of Bayonetta 3, had come out and said, hey, we're going to have a new voice for Bayonetta 3. There was some scheduling conflicts with Hellena Taylor, so they won't be able to reprise their role. And everyone was like, that's weird, but okay. And then out of nowhere, Hellena Taylor on Twitter comes out and is like, I turned down the role because they only offered me $4,000 for the entire job. And the entirety of the internet really just pointed a bunch of laser guns at Platinum Games for this, understandably so. Video games have a very long history of abusing their staff. Everything from the video game developers and tons of crunch, underpayment for developers, and then just kind of abusing their talent in a lot of ways too, both with underpayment, overwork, people destroying their vocal cords and stuff. It's not unique to the video game industry. It's a kind of universal problem across entertainment, but when you get these individualized moments that can kind of galvanize a community, this was one of those moments. And so everyone jumped on Hellena Taylor's side, pointed their guns at Platinum Games, was like, what the hell, man? That's bullshit. Hellena Taylor is a unionized actor. There's union rates. Why weren't you going to pay those union rates? And while it's not that they officially made a statement, they leaked documents to the press. We didn't get to physically see those documents, but multiple outlets confirmed that they had seen internal documents from Platinum Games, and I personally feel like Platinum Games leaked these documents as part of a way of making a statement without them having to take an official stance, and that showed that their initial offer to Hellena Taylor was credible. They wanted to pay the union rate. They were willing to pay for 4 or 5 sessions at 4 hours each, because per the union, you're not allowed to work a voice actor more than 4 hours per session to protect their voice. And so that would have meant that Hellena Taylor would have received somewhere around $15,000 to $20,000 for their work on Bayonetta, playing Bayonetta. Now, there's still a conversation to be had on whether $15,000 to $20,000 is enough to be essentially the voice and, presentation of this, major character of a franchise. That's a different conversation, but the reality is that they had offered her a fair rate. Hellena Taylor reportedly came out and said, no, I want $100,000 plus residuals. Platinum Games turned Hellena Taylor down and said, hey, we'd still like your inclusion in this game. We will pay you your union rate for 1 session for you to appear as a cameo. And Hellena Taylor said no, and that's kind of where we kind of think that $4,000 flat price came from, was that $4,000 for a single session to appear as a cameo came from. Now, Bayonetta is going to be voiced, or is now voiced, by Jennifer Hale, another unionized actress from the SAG-AFTRA Guild, same as Hellena Taylor. And this has a lot of controversy even still. People have kind of, turned against Helena Taylor, but now the discussion is, does Jennifer Hale, a very well-renowned critical voice actress, do a good job reprising the role of somebody that they weren't voicing for? Jennifer Hale is an American voice actress doing a British accent for Bayonetta, and then you got that whole discussion. I will say that I felt that it was fantastic. I thought that Jennifer Hale did an incredible job. I thought the voice was great. I didn't have any issues with it. I'm sure if I was somebody that was British or around British voices more often, I might feel differently, but it still felt like Bayonetta to me. It was a fantastic performance that I thought was delivered very, very well, and I didn't take any issues with it. The other character I want to talk about is the newest character to the Bayonetta franchise, Viola. Now, first off, still talking about voices, Viola is voiced by Anna Brisbane, also known as Brizzy Voices. There's a very good chance that you might recognize Brizzy Voices if you've been around YouTube for any amount of time, because Brizzy Voices 12 years ago put out a video where they did the voices for every single Pokemon, the original 150, and I'm pretty sure since then they have done significantly more Pokemon than that. They've redone their initial recording, so they tried to copy the way that the Pokemon sound from the anime, and it went viral. It's been watched however many millions of times, and they've continued to really grow and progress as a content creator, but they also always were working on voice stuff, and I believe their first major role that they got was the voice of Viola in Bayonetta 3. And I really, really like Viola's character. I know that they're a very significant, galvanizing character for a lot of people. Some people disliked Viola immensely. I thought they were a great character. They had a good personality. I found them to be a welcome addition to the game. They're still serious, while still being a bit of a comic relief character. But Bayonetta 3 and Bayonetta as a franchise has always been a serious game that was not always taking itself seriously, and I felt like Viola fit very well into that construction and did a really good job feeling like a natural inclusion while being a brand new presence amongst the franchise. Next, let's talk about accessibility, because I think that's something that we need to talk a lot more about in video games moving forward, and it's something that I feel can be genuinely criticized on the plane of Bayonetta 3, in that there is no accessibility at all. Now, spectacle fighters, they're button mashy, they're combo-y, they want really, stellar response times because you need perfect dodges or perfect blocks or whatever, so they're already not very accessible games to a whole lot of people due to their natural difficulty, and it's not even because there's a large difficulty scale or skill scale, but just because the way that these games function, games like Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, Devil May Cry, some people can't play these games because they're so button mashy or they require really high reflex times, and that makes these games already difficult to get into. And I did find one piece of accessibility in the game. It's an item that removes some of the requirements for things within the game, but unfortunately this item is actually behind, I'll call it a paywall, but it doesn't cost physical money. You need to get in-game credits to be able to buy this item. It's an accessory that you can equip on Bayonetta to make the game easier. But it's the most expensive accessory in the game. You would have to grind your ever-living ass off to be able to afford it. I was able to buy 3 accessories for the same price as the accessibility accessory, and that's just garbage. I don't agree with that at all. There is a difficulty scaling of easy, normal, hard. Bayonetta does include a ultra climax mode that's super duper hard, but we're not going to talk about that right now. So easy mode might make the game a bit more approachable, but it still doesn't change the game in terms of making it more accessible. It just makes it more difficult to lose. So we'll put that note on accessibility to the side. It is something that I think you should be aware of, and it's something that we need to hold games accountable for. Now, with all that said, though, Bayonetta 3 is by far the easiest and most accessible of the Bayonetta games. Bayonetta 1 is by far the hardest game in the trilogy. It has really hard quick time requirements that are pass or game over. There is no in between. It has really aggressive button mashing climax segments that, again, if you don't do them well enough, it is game over. It has an extremely high level of combat tuning, even on lower difficulties, to where the game is just difficult if you are not really in sync with what the game wants. Bayonetta 2 made this a lot easier. They removed a lot of those quick time events. They made the button mashing a little bit easier, and the game's overall difficulty was lower. And Bayonetta 3 goes even farther. The quick time events are completely gone. Thankfully, those were left back in 2019, where we never have to see them again, and I'll be really glad if they stay there forever. And all of the button mashing segments are, you can almost lazily tap the button and be able to make it there. This makes it a bit more approachable, but it still doesn't solve that initial problem of accessibility. Now, while the game is by far the easiest game in the trilogy, it's still fun. They have simplified some things in other ways because of the sake of new mechanics that they introduced. Weapons have been simplified. In previous games, you were able to equip different weapons onto your gun and onto your hands and onto your feet. And so you were able to, put like a katana in your hands and ice skates on your feet, or you could put rockets on your feet and shotgun tonfas onto your hands. And you could mix and match weapons to create your own combos, to really build out your own set the way that you really wanted it to go. That's not in Bayonetta 3 anymore. You get a singular weapon, and that weapon occupies your entire weapon slot. But they haven't just left it at that and removed that type of customization. There are new mechanics that exist in this. First off is a form of finishers. Your weapon dictates a sort of demon form that Bayonetta 3 can take, and you get finishers based off of what weapon you're holding that allows you to kind of get a new type of way to close out your combos based on the weapon you're holding. And this includes a bar that you can fill up to get kind of like a super attack that you can use during combat. And this is different from Bayonetta's like super flashy cinematic finishers. These are just extra bonus damage that you get if you're able to fill up these bars. But the main new mechanic is the ability to summon demons. Now, Bayonetta was always able to summon demons, but they would normally do this as, like I said, those really cinematic finishers. You'd button mash and a demon would pop out, and you'd have this cool cutscene where it chomps and chews or rips apart your enemy, and then the boss is dead, right? You can summon those demons now in regular combat. It's literally just a button press, the demon pops out of nowhere, Bayonetta does her dance, and you're able to control this monster and fight in your normal combat segments. This is the new mechanic that allows more customization because you can equip different weapons alongside different demons, and the demons function very, very different from one another because you have everything from a spider to a dragon to just a big Madame Butterfly to a tower, okay? They get all over the place. And they function very differently from one another. And if you get acquainted with that system, you can actually summon the demon, tell it to do some attacks, and while its big hulking mass is trying to do its attacks, you can drop control of it, get some attacks in on your own, and then if you're quick enough and you do your timing correctly, you can regain control of it and give it more instructions, and then just keep bouncing between the two, so you kind of just maintain this really significant momentum of this ongoing onslaught against your opponents. It's really satisfying when you get down to like really grasping and understanding it. That said though, it never feels like it generally gets its moment of appreciation. Part of this is because the environments have been made bigger for the sake of having more enemies, and there is a new enemy type in the form of the homunculi. In previous Bayonetta games, Bayonetta 1 you were fighting against angels, in Bayonetta 2 you were fighting against demons, and in Bayonetta 3 you're fighting against these homunculi. And while there wasn't a significant amount of enemy variety in previous Bayonetta games, the enemies felt different and they looked different. The enemies in Bayonetta 3 are all these kind of amorphous green blob creatures with some white chitinous armor. And because they're these like armored green blobs, they all look very, very similar. And all of the bosses also feel very, very similar too. And I think the largest part about that is actually because none of the enemies have any character. In Bayonetta 1 and 2, the enemies had character. Each boss, in Bayonetta 1, you're fighting against a significant angel. In Bayonetta 2, you're fighting against a significant demon. And those demons and angels had their own personality. They knew who Bayonetta was, and they would, on their own as an individual, talk to Bayonetta about what Bayonetta doing was right or wrong, or how it was hopeless, or how they were going to stop her, or whatever, right? And you don't have any of that in Bayonetta 3. All of the big major enemies in Bayonetta 3 are all being controlled by the big bad evil guy, and he's just a ghost face Mufasa style character, and he always says basically the same things. So it's not that I don't think that the designs are great, it just feels like they lose so much by not getting to be their own level of enemies, and to that it kind of takes away from a lot of their presentation and impact compared to the way that major enemies were presented in Bayonetta 1 and 2. Now, there is one other gameplay part in this, which is you do get to play as Viola. In previous games, you were always playing Bayonetta. You did have the option of alternate characters. You could unlock other characters later on in the game, but they all still played the same. They might have very slight tweaks or changes, or maybe they take and deal extra damage, but otherwise, they were still the same gameplay style that you'd been doing for however many hours as you played as Bayonetta, and normally these were post-game unlocks. Viola in Bayonetta 3 is the exception here, in that Viola is a required played section where you have to play as Viola, and Viola does not play like Bayonetta does. It's not a significant change, but it does have a singular mechanical alteration that is a significant change. So all the Bayonetta games have a mechanic called Witch Time, whereas if you dodge at the correct point in time, basically right as the enemy is about to hit you, you will activate a short window of time where the enemies will move in slow motion, you're moving in regular time, and you just get an opportunity to beat the ever-living bejesus out of that enemy that you perfect dodged. Viola doesn't have that ability to do it from a dodge. Instead, Viola can only activate Witch Time if they do a perfect parry, which most of the time Bayonetta does not have a parry. Dodge is what you rely on to avoid damage and to activate quick time, to activate Witch Time, which means that you get that opportunity for that extra damage. Now, parries and dodges often will go hand in hand in video games. If we take a look at Soulsians across history, Dark Souls all the way through Elden Ring or Neo or whatever, generally you have both of these options available to you, parry and dodge. But they have different pros and cons available to them. Dodges are purely defensive, they allow you to reposition, which I guess you could see as an offensive, and they will mitigate damage by you just not taking any as long as you dodge properly to avoid the enemy's attack. Parries, on the other hand, are normally high risk, high reward mechanics. If you parry correctly, you will create a window in your opponent's defense to get like a critical strike, a visceral, whatever you want to call it. They'll be disarmed for a short amount of time that just allows extra damage to go through. Viola does have the ability to dodge, but so much of your damage in Bayonetta is reliant on those Witch Time events that in order for you to get those opportunities, especially against bosses, you need to parry them in order to activate Witch Time so that you can get your damage window in. But parries, again, are high risk, high reward. If you mess it up, you eat that damage to the face. And after you've been playing as Bayonetta for hours and you're just really gotten into this rhythm of like dodge, 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 dodge to get out of this, dodge to be rewarded with Witch Time, moving away from dodging at all to you need to try to perfect time your parries is brutal. Because in Bayonetta, if you don't get a perfect dodge to where you activate Witch Time, there's a very, very good chance that you still succeeded in dodging, and you will still mitigate that damage. Maybe you reposition, maybe you can get one or two small hits in, it's not nearly as beneficial as activating Witch Time, but you're still rolling, right? With Viola and the parry mechanic, if you don't get it right, you just get punished, and you get punished very brutally. It's not that I don't think it's a good mechanic, I think it is, it's just after playing for hours as Bayonetta and being forced into these Viola segments, it feels super punishing in a painful way. I think that if we see a Bayonetta 4, which we will see a Bayonetta 4, that if Viola is maybe something that you play as earlier on, it'd be easier to adjust into, but there is definitely a bunch of like shock involved with being hard shoved into that new mechanic when it wasn't something that we had really had at any point previously in the franchise, let alone in the hours leading up to when that mechanic was introduced. The other thing that we need to talk about for Bayonetta 3 is its performance. Okay, so Bayonetta 3 is a Nintendo Switch exclusive. The Nintendo Switch is a very low-powered console. The Nintendo Switch is running on hardware that was dated when it came out. Its chip is based off of a tablet chip from 2015. This system is old. Now that said, while I say it is old, there are definitely developers that have made things work on the Nintendo Switch, and it's very impressive. One of the biggest, heralds of that is Monolith Soft. They were pulled from their Xenoblade projects to help work on The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. That's an incredible looking game. This very developer that made Bayonetta 3, Platinum Games, made Astral Chain, and while it made my Switch overheat, the game ran really well. And back to Monolith Soft, Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is this big, massive, expansive, very beautiful game. I wish it had more resolution. It doesn't, but they made work with it what they could. And Bayonetta 3 definitely pushes the Nintendo Switch to its limits the same way that a game like Xenoblade Chronicles 3 does. The game runs really well overall. Like, it probably maintains a pretty solid 40 to 45 FPS. That's not 60, I wish it was, but it runs pretty well, especially compared to a lot of the other games that we can look at on the console. But it didn't achieve this frame rate through just good development. There was definitely some sacrifices that were made for this. The biggest of which are visual sacrifices. We talked earlier about the demon summoning mechanic. Well, that mechanic requires a larger space for the game to fight in. You need room for this demon to pop up out of the ground and be able to move around and do their attacks in. And you need to have large enemies to make those demons feel relevant against, because if all the demon is doing is bashing around their little chew toys that are, the same size as a normal person, that's not the same as having a big thing fight a big thing. So you have these significantly larger environments, but these environments are very empty and don't have very good resolution. And you can't really make up for that in any way. That was done to accommodate the mechanics of the game. And while the game still runs well, the environments are so disappointing. And it's just because of the limitations of the console. And the problem with that really is that there's no way to improve that in the future. If we ever get a Super Nintendo Switch or a Nintendo Switch 2, or if Bayonetta 3 ever gets ported to another console or PC, it won't, it's Nintendo. If it ever does, if it gets access to better hardware, sure, the game will run better. You might be able to get the game to run at 1080p, 60 frames per second, or 4K 30, or 4K 60, or whatever, right? But you can't add in things that don't exist. Sure, there might be higher textures in the files, so there might be like 1080p textures that are being downscaled to like 540p for the sake of helping the game run smoothly. So you can put those back up to their 1080p levels, but the empty environments, there's nothing there to improve on. You can't add, road clutter and environment detail. You can't add extra leaves to the trees if the leaves don't exist. And that'll mean that even if we do get better hardware for Bayonetta 3, it will never look better. It'll run better, it'll play better, but it won't look better. And that's really unfortunate, because this game is such a spectacle that I think that it would be such an impressive display if it wasn't locked to the Nintendo Switch. I feel like the Nintendo Switch isn't necessarily holding Bayonetta 3 back as a game, but I feel like as a presentation, the Nintendo Switch is holding Bayonetta 3 back. One of the other places that we can see this in is these kaiju style battles. So you do have, during your regular combat section, the ability to summon a demon and have them do their attacks, but there's these other sections to where it is even bigger, right? You have city-sized enemies fighting city-sized enemies. But the way that these work is not in any grandiose way. You're literally playing rock, paper, scissors against your enemy. Your options are bite, block, or punch, and that's it. And one of those beats the other ones in a nice little triangle Rochambeau style. And I feel like these segments were meant to be more of a spectacle, but because of the limitations of the hardware, they just couldn't put it into where you have these large-scale detailed enemies in these larger environments and have them do something more than beyond these kind of slow rock, paper, scissors style attacks. It's really unfortunate. But ultimately, I really liked everything that was in here. I can definitely just see where we're falling short and really reaching the end of the top scale of what the Nintendo Switch can achieve as we see these really high-end developers push it to its absolute limits. One other thing I want to talk about before we work on closing out is the game has a naive angel mode, which is, I understand, but also in the form of Bayonetta 3, I don't necessarily understand. So the naive angel mode is a censorship mode, okay? Bayonetta as a franchise is known for the sexual nature of its main character especially. Bayonetta, she's dressed in her hair and all of her clothes disappears as she uses her hair to go down into hell and summon forth a demon, and she is completely naked when she does this, right? And there's many a moments where Bayonetta is being sexy for the sake of her feeling like she wants to be sexy, right? There's nothing wrong with that. It just is a very defining thing about the game. Great combat. I highly recommend the games. They're fun as hell. But just be aware, if you're going into Bayonetta 1, don't play it with your parents in the room because they might have some questions. Because some of the things that Bayonetta does to some of those enemies, those are just straight up sexual torture. Not even a joke. So going into Bayonetta 3, it having a naive angel mode made sense as an initial thought. However, everything that I just talked about, I'm mostly referencing Bayonetta 1. A lot of that sexuality type stuff, that sexual nature, innuendos, straight blatant like shots of Bayonetta's boobs, and then the camera slowly pans through her crotch, lingers on her ass before zooming out and you beat the shit out of some things. That doesn't happen in Bayonetta 3 at all. There is like one moment where like Bayonetta like moans just a little bit before she just goes into combat mode. Even when Bayonetta summons demons, most of the time she's wearing like this leotard thing still, which like goes down her chest and stuff. She's still like partially dressed. So, and the naive angel mode is meant to censor those moments to where either the clothes don't disappear. I know at one point like a cigar gets turned into a candy bar and stuff. And so I guess for that purpose, it still serves a purpose, but Bayonetta 3 is wildly tame. Super tame compared to previous entries in the franchise, to the point that they feel almost disconnected with how tame Bayonetta 3 is compared to Bayonetta 1 and 2. I don't mind it. I didn't feel like it took away from Bayonetta 3 because some of those segments are so gratuitous that they're almost awkward. But Bayonetta 3 has almost none of them, and that's okay. But it just made the idea of including a naive angel mode almost silly with just how tame the games are. I don't know. I know that Bayonetta 2 on the Switch didn't get this added, and I don't believe Bayonetta 1 did either, and both of those games could benefit from this significantly more as like an added feature than Bayonetta 3 does. But I imagine that'd probably be more work to actually go back and redo a whole bunch of stuff in those previous games compared to building it up from the beginning. So just a note of just like, it's kind of funny that it's there when it doesn't actually serve a purpose because of how tame this game is comparatively. So as we close, Bayonetta 3 I think is a great game, and it's really brought down a small notch by the Nintendo Switch as its hardware. I think that this game could have been so much more than it is if it wasn't locked onto the Nintendo Switch. And it's really just because this game wanted to be bigger than Bayonetta 1 and 2. Bayonetta 1 and 2 both still look really good on the Switch, but they are more smaller, condensed, contained games. You're fighting in smaller courtyards, hallways, but none of that was possible in Bayonetta 3 because of the mechanic of summoning big demons alongside you. So all of the environments had to be bigger, but they're all so empty and so boring looking in a lot of ways because they couldn't put a lot of detail into them because of the limitations on the Nintendo Switch. I do have hope for Bayonetta 4 because by that time we should have the Super Nintendo Switch or Nintendo Switch 2 or whatever they end up calling it. And initially I was curious of like if we'd even see a Bayonetta 4. I was hoping that maybe we'd see that the drama that we talked about at the beginning of the video would lead to extra sales for the game to where Bayonetta 4 might have a higher chance of getting funded. But in recent talks, Hideki Kamiya, one of the leads for Bayonetta 4, was just like, oh yeah, we're already working on it. It'll be a ways away. Don't expect it anytime soon, but yeah, we're already working on it. And I was like, wow, okay, that's cool. Oftentimes we're waiting for years to hear if there's even a hope of a new game in any franchise, let alone Bayonetta. And even Bayonetta 3 was something that was just like whispered about on the wind for years until finally they're like, yes, here's a logo. And we were like, oh, will you tell us more? And they're like, no. And we're like, oh, okay, cool. But for them to just outright on Twitter just be like, oh yeah, Bayonetta 4. confirmed. We're working on it now. It's like, holy crap, really? Okay, cool. Okay, thanks. Where does this game sit on a critical scale? Honestly, it really depends on a subjective level of your appreciation for Bayonetta as a franchise, or character action fighters or spectacle fighters as a genre. Ultimately, I'd place this game at like a 7.5, maybe an 8 out of 10, and it really relies on you getting through the game, because there's parts in the middle that you're just like, I don't know if this is it, man. And then it just wraps up in a way that you're like, nah, that was awesome. At least that's the way I felt, right? So I'd really recommend it if you're a fan of character action fighters or spectacle fighters, if you like games like Devil May Cry, if you like Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, if you like Astral Chain, if those are games that you enjoyed and appreciated, this is another game in a pretty small genre that you could enjoy and you could appreciate. There will be a lot of debate for years to come over some choices in the story. For spoiler reasons, I'm not talking about them here, and I haven't talked to them at all at this point. And so it's really just kind of up to you on if this feels like something that's approachable. That said, I will make a separate recommendation for a game that is more widely available. If you want a character action spectacle fighter that is available on more platforms, that is essentially what Bayonetta would be, at least to me, what Bayonetta would be if it wasn't locked on the Nintendo Switch, go play Solstice. Solstice is a game from a very new studio. I don't remember what country they're from. It's somewhere in Europe. They're super small. It's one of their first games, and it is incredible. It is literally just if Devil May Cry and Bayonetta had a baby, and that baby was really, really into Claymore. Highly recommended if you don't have a Nintendo Switch but do have a PlayStation or a PC gamer, or if you just don't want the limitations of the Nintendo Switch on what it would have, go play Solstice. But that concludes our one-take review for Bayonetta 3. Please let me know what your thoughts are on Bayonetta 3 as a franchise or as this game, or what you think the future of it might hold. Put your thoughts down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave it a like. If you want to catch future videos, please subscribe to the channel. And if you go watch one of the other videos on the channel, or if I see you in the live stream, thank you and enjoy.